When we talk about possibility, we often talk about it as though it's out there, some objective condition waiting to be discovered. But this is a mistake. Possibility doesn't begin in the world. It begins in the psyche. It begins with what the individual allows themselves to conceive of, to feel, to act upon. The most profound limits in life are not physical. They are psychological. They exist in the assumptions we inherit, the beliefs we internalize, the silent agreements we make with fear. You've likely heard people say things like, "I just don't see how that's possible," or "that's not realistic." But realism, for most, is simply a disguised form of resignation. It's a protective gesture, a way to avoid the discomfort of wanting something we've been taught not to want. Because the moment you admit a deeper desire, you are suddenly responsible for what you do with it. So, instead, many people suppress the impulse altogether. They call it being practical. They think they are playing it safe. In reality, they are letting the ego's need for control eclipse the soul's longing to expand. Carl Jung understood this inner conflict intimately. He believed that the human being is not fundamentally a rational creature, but a symbolic one. We move not just by logic, but by meaning. And when the soul senses a vision, something higher, larger, more whole, it moves toward it, even if it doesn't make sense to the conscious mind. That movement is what we call possibility. Not because the thing is easy, not because it's guaranteed, but because it aligns with something within us that knows we are not meant to remain static. But the modern world trains us to distrust that instinct. We are surrounded by systems that reward compliance, institutions that prefer predictability, cultures that conflate limitation with humility. So we adapt, we internalize those systems, and little by little, we stop questioning the boundaries around us. We forget that most so-called impossibilities are not facts, but psychic conclusions, formed by a younger version of ourselves reacting to failure, shame, or rejection. When you act as if nothing is impossible, you're not denying reality, you're choosing to create a new one. You're stepping into a mode of being where the psyche is no longer organized around fear, but around expansion. And that shift is not theoretical, it's practical. It begins with the imagination. Before a new behavior can take form, the mind must be able to hold the idea of it. And that idea must be permitted, not analyzed, not shamed, not dismissed, but welcomed. The imagination is not just for art. It's the blueprint of becoming. It's the space where the psyche rehearses new identities, new responses, new visions of what is possible. When you deny your imagination, you deny your potential. But when you begin to imagine differently, to envision something once deemed impossible, you don't just change your mindset, you change the architecture of your internal world. New pathways begin to form, new associations emerge, and slowly what once seemed unreachable starts to feel inevitable. This is why the real battleground is always internal. You cannot create a life beyond your current assumptions unless you challenge the narrative you've been unconsciously living in. You have to recognize which voice in you is setting the limits. Is it the voice of your highest self, or the voice of your wounded self trying to protect you from disappointment? Most often it's the latter. And until you learn to distinguish between the two, you'll mistake fear for wisdom and caution for clarity. But once you do recognize the difference, once you start asking, whose voice is this? You begin to reclaim authority over your own vision. You begin to notice the small ways you've been folding yourself in, playing small, acting in accordance with an inherited sense of what's possible. And that noticing is everything. Because with awareness comes choice. And with choice comes power. Now, acting as if nothing is impossible does not mean acting recklessly. It means acting with psychological alignment. It means letting your behavior reflect your inner potential rather than your past limitations. It means allowing your actions to lead belief rather than waiting for certainty before you begin. It is, in the deepest sense, a return to sovereignty, where you become the author of your own becoming, rather than a passive reader of the world's script. So the question is not, is this possible? The question is, what version of myself would make this possible, and am I willing to become that? Because everything external begins internally. Before it is real, it must be imaginable. Before it is achievable, it must be believable. And before it is inevitable, it must be chosen, again and again, in thought, in word, and most importantly, in action. Stop asking if it can be done. Start acting like the one who does it. That's where the impossible begins to lose its name. Belief, despite what many assume, is not the product of evidence. It's the precondition for it. In fact, waiting for proof before you believe is one of the most effective ways to ensure that nothing in your life ever truly changes. This idea might sound counterintuitive in a world obsessed with facts, data, and rational outcomes. But if you look closely, not at machines but at people, you'll find that human transformation never begins with certainty. It begins with a decision to believe before the world gives permission. To act as if nothing is impossible is not to deny reality. It is to understand that reality bends, not through delusion, but through sustained intention. Before any great shift in a person's life, there is a moment of inner defiance, a moment when they choose to trust something they can't yet prove. That moment is what Jung might have called a confrontation with the self, a willingness to follow a deeper knowing even when the ego protests, even when the outer world remains unchanged. We have to remember that the psyche does not respond to logic in the same way the conscious mind does. The unconscious speaks through symbol, gesture, and metaphor. It doesn't ask, is this statistically likely? It asks, what story are you living? And if the story you enact each day is one of limitation, doubt, and caution, your unconscious will organize your inner life to match. You'll overlook possibilities, you'll avoid risk, you'll instinctively self-censor, not because you can't, but because you've rehearsed the posture of disbelief so many times that it becomes a kind of internal law. But that law is not fixed. It can be rewritten, and the rewriting begins with behavior. This is why acting as if your vision is already possible, even before the evidence supports it, is a psychologically powerful move. You are sending a signal, not only to the world, but to your own unconscious. You are saying, this is who I am becoming, this is what I expect. And the psyche, ever responsive to repetition and ritual, begins to reconfigure around that expectation. This is not performance. It's not fake it till you make it. It's not pretending. It's practicing. There's a profound difference. Pretending is rooted in insecurity, in fear of being exposed. Practicing is rooted in identity. You're not trying to appear confident, capable, or visionary. You are training yourself to become those things through embodiment. You are rehearsing a new psychic reality, one that eventually becomes so integrated that it no longer feels like belief. It simply is. Here's the truth. Evidence always follows belief because evidence is filtered through perception. If you believe that something is out of reach, you will unconsciously ignore or sabotage the very opportunities that could prove otherwise. You won't see them, you won't recognize them, and if you do, you'll talk yourself out of them. Not because the opportunity wasn't real, but because your internal state couldn't accommodate it. This is why so many people remain stuck even when external conditions improve. They win the lottery but still feel broke. They gain an audience but still feel invisible. They achieve their goal but still feel like imposters. The psyche has not yet caught up. It's still living in an older belief system, one that cannot metabolize success or transformation. And so it rejects it. Quietly, unconsciously, but consistently. But the inverse is also true. When you begin to act from belief, not toward it, from it, you start to generate a different kind of evidence, small wins, unexpected synchronicities, moments of flow, and more importantly, an inner shift. A subtle yet profound change in how you experience time, energy, and even failure. Things stop feeling like confirmation of your limitations and start feeling like invitations to go deeper, further, higher. You become less reactive and more creative, less defined by circumstance, more defined by intention. At this point, people may say you've become lucky. They'll call you fearless. But what's actually happening is that you've stopped waiting. You've stopped asking the world for permission to believe. And in doing so, you've changed the terms of the inner contract. You've become the source of momentum, rather than its recipient. Jung once noted that we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In this case, the darkness is our insistence on needing proof before we allow ourselves to act with conviction. That insistence is rooted in fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of failing, fear of hope itself. But you cannot transform while still bowing to the old fears. At some point, you must act as if the vision is real, not because it's easy, but because the alternative is stagnation. And so the question is not whether you have enough proof to believe. The question is whether you have enough imagination to begin without it. Because belief is not what follows success, it's what makes it possible. Stop waiting to believe, start behaving like belief is already yours. That is the first real evidence that transformation has begun. Identity, contrary to popular belief, is not a fixed essence. It's not a static self hiding deep within us, waiting to be discovered. It is a pattern, shaped and reshaped by the choices we make, the roles we accept, the actions we repeat. You become who you are, not through introspection alone, but through repetition, through movement, through ritual. And this is why acting as if nothing is impossible is not just a mindset shift, it's an identity shift, one that must be forged in practice, not just in theory. When Jung spoke of the self, he wasn't referring to the ego, the part of us that navigates the world, seeks approval, avoids pain. He was pointing to something deeper, the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, known and unknown. To move toward that self requires more than intellectual insight. It requires embodiment. The ego must yield to the larger force within, and that process is rarely comfortable. It demands action, it demands sacrifice, it demands the willingness to act in accordance with a future self that does not yet feel fully real. Every time you take an action that aligns with a possibility greater than your present self-position, you are not just moving toward a goal, you are constructing a new identity. You are teaching your nervous system, your memory, your unconscious expectations that this is who you are now. And the psyche responds to this consistency. Like a forest trail slowly carved through footsteps, the more often you walk the path of your desired self, the more natural it becomes. Not easier, necessarily, but more yours. Think for a moment about someone you admire, not because of their status, but because of their integrity, their clarity, their courage. What defines that person is not their talents or resources. It's the way they inhabit a particular set of values, repeatedly, regardless of outcome. They act from who they have decided to be. Their behavior precedes their identity, not the other way around. This is one of the most misunderstood truths in personal growth. That you don't need to feel confident to act confidently. You don't need to feel powerful to act powerfully. In fact, most genuine change begins in a state of discomfort because you're operating outside the familiar bounds of the ego, and that's precisely the point. You must be willing to contradict your current identity in service of a deeper one. You must take the risk of behaving like someone you're still becoming. And this is where most people hesitate. They think, who am I to do this? That question arises from a fragmented self-immersion, one still entangled in old narratives of failure, fear, rejection. But here's the thing, you don't escape those narratives by analyzing them. You escape them by acting in defiance of them. Each time you speak when you're afraid, create when you feel blocked, or move when you feel paralyzed, you send a clear message to your unconscious, we are no longer living that old story. And slowly, the unconscious listens, not because it was convinced by argument, but because it witnessed a new pattern. It observed your behavior and concluded, this must be who we are now. That's how identity changes, from the ground up, through lived experience. And the more you practice this alignment between action and aspiration, the more coherent your internal world becomes. The parts of you that once felt at odds begin to integrate. And that integration is what Jung referred to as individuation, the process of becoming whole, of becoming fully yourself. But none of this happens passively. It is not enough to believe in possibility. You must train your body, your language, your habits to reflect that belief. Otherwise, you remain fragmented, an ideal self imagined in theory but never brought to life. There is a kind of psychic dissonance that arises when you know what you're capable of, but consistently act beneath it. That dissonance becomes fatigue, resentment, shame, and the only way to resolve it is to close the gap, not all at once, but deliberately, step by step. Your actions matter more than you think, not just for results, but for self-concept. Every time you honor a higher aim, you reinforce a new identity. And with that identity comes new perception, new courage, new meaning. You begin to see the world not as an obstacle course, but as a mirror, reflecting back who you believe you are. That reflection may not always be kind, but if you remain committed to the practice, to the becoming, you will one day look around and realize that the impossible didn't happen all at once. It happened incrementally, each time you chose action over avoidance. So if you're waiting to feel ready, to feel certain, to feel like the real version of yourself has arrived, stop. That version isn't found, it's built. And it's built through repetition. Through the daily, sometimes unglamorous, always sacred act of showing up as if nothing is impossible. The self you long to become will not arrive. It must be summoned, through action, through choice, through the discipline of becoming real. There is a quiet tragedy that runs through much of modern life, one that often goes unnoticed, yet shapes everything from our ambitions to our sense of time. It is the belief that our transformation must be scheduled, that fulfillment must wait for the right moment. We say we will act when we feel ready, when we've acquired enough knowledge, when the timing is better, when the world offers us a clearer sign. But what we don't often see is that the act of postponing is itself a declaration. It is a decision to remain who we've been, cloaked in the illusion of preparation. To act as if nothing is impossible means precisely this, that you stop waiting to become what you already are in potential. You live the possibility now, not later, not after conditions improve, not after the fear subsides. Because the truth is, the fear may never fully leave. The doubt may always whisper. The resistance might never give you the permission you think you need. But none of those are reasons to delay. They are only reminders that you are standing at the edge of your old self, and to cross over you must act in defiance of its rules. Jung once said, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it." And what many people have yet to accept is this, that time will not bring you courage. Time will not resolve the internal split between who you are and who you long to be. Only action can do that. Only stepping into the unknown before it feels safe, before it feels justified, can reconcile the divided self. Because delay, while often dressed as wisdom, is usually rooted in fear, and fear, left unchallenged, calcifies into habit. You might think, but there are real reasons I can't act yet. And yes, there are always practical constraints, but if you look deeper, many of those reasons are protective narratives, structures built by the ego to avoid risk. The ego fears failure not just because of pain, but because it threatens its identity. It fears that if you try and fail, the story it tells about who you are will collapse. And it's right, that story will collapse. But what takes its place is something more powerful, the beginning of a self no longer defined by avoidance, but by engagement. You see, the act of beginning, of choosing movement over inertia, is more than a behavior. It's a psychological threshold. It tells the unconscious we are no longer operating under the same assumptions. You don't need to take massive leaps. A single step, taken with conviction, carries the weight of transformation. Not because of what it achieves externally, but because of what it initiates internally. It shifts the psyche from passivity to authorship. When you stop postponing your becoming, you stop outsourcing your authority. You stop asking the world for signs that it's time. You become the sign. You start to realize that waiting for clarity is often a subtle way of avoiding responsibility. Clarity, after all, is born of movement. It does not precede the path. It emerges from it. We learn by doing. We evolve by deciding. And when you act as if nothing is impossible, you are not arrogantly assuming success. You are simply choosing to live aligned with possibility rather than fear. This doesn't mean you rush blindly forward, it means you begin, knowing full well that mistakes will be made, discomfort will arise, and the old self will resist. But the decision to begin, despite all that, is what Jung might call an act of individuation. It is the movement toward wholeness, not perfection, but coherence, the integration of desire and behavior, the alignment of your inner truth with your outer action. There is a sacredness to the present moment that we often miss. We imagine the future as the realm of transformation, but the future is only the echo of what you choose now. The self you hope to become is watching how you behave today. Not tomorrow, not next month, today. It's in the way you speak, the way you carry your body, the way you respond to resistance. Each gesture either affirms the old self or calls forth the new one. And that's the quiet revolution, not in grand declarations, but in the daily decision to act in alignment with your deepest potential, no matter how small the step, no matter how loud the fear. You choose to become, not later, but now. The life you're waiting for is already waiting for you, on the other side of action. Step into it, not when you're ready, when you decide.